They thought he was just another undocumented Latino, until they realized he was a U.S. Navy Rear Admiral, and their careers ended that night. The late afternoon sun burned orange over El Paso, Texas, casting long shadows across the downtown bus terminal. Families moved through the waiting area, clutching bags of groceries or worn suitcases. The hum of Spanish and English intertwined, a familiar rhythm in this border city. Among them walked Alejandro Torres, a tall man in his late 50s with salt and pepper hair cropped close to his head, and a posture that radiated discipline. He wore plain khaki slacks, a dark polo shirt, and carried nothing more than a leather briefcase. To most eyes, he looked like another middle-aged man traveling through town. To those who looked closer, though, his eyes told a different story, eyes hardened by years of command, strategy, and oceans crossed under the banner of the United States Navy. But that evening, no one at the bus terminal saw a decorated rear admiral. What they saw was a Latino man with an accent, alone, waiting quietly in a corner seat. Two ICE agents patrolling the terminal had their eyes fixed on him. Agent Mark Danner, tall, broad, and known among his colleagues for his aggressive methods, nudged his partner. "That one," he muttered, jerking his chin toward Torres. "He's not supposed to be here. Fetch you a beer, he's undocumented." His partner, Agent Wilson, younger but eager to prove himself, adjusted his vest and smirked. "Easy target. Let's check him out." The two men approached Alejandro with the kind of swagger that came from unchecked authority. Alejandro glanced up, instantly reading their body language. He had seen the same posture on sailors itching for a fight during deployment. "Sir," Danner said in a tone that wasn't a question but a demand, "we need to see some identification. You're under federal jurisdiction here." Alejandro set down his briefcase slowly, meeting the man's eyes with calm composure. "Is there a problem, Agent?" "Don't play games," Wilson snapped. "Let's see some papers. Passport, green card, whatever you've got." A ripple of irritation ran through Alejandro, but he suppressed it. He had faced storms in the South China Sea, pirates off the Horn of Africa, and diplomatic standoffs in foreign ports. He wasn't about to let two young men with badges rattle him. Still, there was an edge to their tone that he didn't like. "I'm a U.S. citizen," Alejandro said evenly. "I don't carry a passport to travel across my own country. And I'm not required to present identification to federal officers without cause." That sentence, precise and calm, struck the wrong chord. Danner sneered, stepping closer. "You think you're a lawyer? Listen, pal, we know your type. You sneak in, you act like you belong, and then when someone calls you out, you get clever." Alejandro's jaw tightened. "I've served this nation longer than you've been alive, son. Show some respect." The word son ignited Danner's temper. He shoved Alejandro's shoulder hard enough that the chair rattled against the floor. People in the terminal turned to look, but most quickly averted their eyes. No one wanted trouble with ICE. Wilson added, "Get up. We're detaining you for questioning." Alejandro rose slowly, deliberately, towering slightly over Wilson. His voice was low but firm. "I suggest you think very carefully about what you're doing. This will not end the way you think." To the agents, those words sounded like defiance. To Alejandro, they were a warning born of experience. But the moment spiraled. Danner grabbed Alejandro's arm roughly, twisting it behind his back. Alejandro winced but refused to cry out. He had endured worse in military training, worse in combat zones. Still, humiliation burned as people watched. Wilson struck next, shoving him toward the wall, barking, "Stop resisting," even though Alejandro hadn't lifted a hand. His briefcase clattered to the ground, papers spilling, maps, notes, and a sealed Navy envelope with classified insignia that no civilian eye should have seen. But in their blind arrogance, the agents ignored it. Instead, they slammed him against the wall, pressing his cheek into the cold concrete. Danner hissed, "You think you're tough? We deal with people like you every day. You're nothing but a liar." Alejandro felt anger boil in his chest, but discipline kept him from lashing out. He could have thrown either man to the ground in seconds. Decades of hand-to-hand combat training were ingrained in his reflexes. But violence wasn't the answer, not yet. The scene stretched painfully. A mother shielded her child's eyes. An old man shook his head but said nothing. Phones came out, discreetly, cautiously, capturing the injustice on shaky screens. Alejandro managed to speak through clenched teeth. "Release me. This is a grave mistake," Wilson barked a laugh. "The only mistake was letting you slip past the border. We're fixing that right now." By then the agents had handcuffed him, ignoring the bruising on his wrist. They dragged him across the terminal floor like a criminal, his dignity scraping along with his body. Each step reverberated with irony. Here was a man who had once commanded fleets, humiliated by rookies too blinded by prejudice to see who stood before them. As they hauled him toward the exit, Alejandro's gaze swept the crowd. A few brave souls recorded everything, but most looked away. He didn't blame them. Fear of authority was powerful, and ICE had a reputation that silenced even the bold. Still, one young woman with a phone whispered urgently, "Don't worry, sir. I'm recording everything." Alejandro gave her the faintest nod. Evidence mattered. Truth mattered. The agents shoved him into the back of a van, metal door slamming shut like a prison gate. The interior smelled of sweat and despair, its benches scarred by the passage of countless detainees. Alejandro sat upright despite the cuffs, his bearing unbroken. Inside he seethed, not for himself but for the principle of it. Men sworn to serve the nation abusing their power against its own citizens. In that van, he thought back to his oath, the one he swore decades ago at the Naval Academy, to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. He had always understood foreign, but moments like this made him painfully aware of the domestic. As the engine roared to life, Alejandro closed his eyes briefly. He knew the truth would surface eventually. He was not an undocumented immigrant. He was not a nameless face in the crowd. He was Rear Admiral Alejandro Torres, U.S. Navy, recipient of the Legion of Merit, commander of fleets, strategist trusted by generals and presidents alike. And when these men discovered what they had done, the fallout would shake their careers, perhaps even the agency itself. But for now, they saw only a Latino man they thought they could break, and Alejandro vowed, silently but firmly, "They will learn who I am, and they will regret this day." The ICE van rumbled down the highway, its reinforced chassis rattling with every pothole. Rear Admiral Alejandro Torres sat cuffed to the bench, his hands resting calmly on his knees. The agents riding in the front spoke in low, mocking tones that carried easily through the metal partition. "Can you believe the nerve of that guy?" Wilson snorted. "Talking back like he's somebody. Just another illegal thinking he knows the law." Danner chuckled darkly. "Yeah, well, he'll learn soon enough. Once he's in processing, he'll beg for a one-way bus ride back across the border. They all do." Alejandro closed his eyes and took a slow breath. He had learned long ago that patience was its own weapon. But inside indignation burned. Not for his own sake. He had endured worse humiliations in foreign prisons during classified missions, but for the countless others who had no rank, no power, no voice. He thought of the men and women he had fought beside, some of them immigrants themselves who had bled for the flag stitched on their uniforms. How would they feel if they could see him now, treated like an enemy on the very soil they defended? The van slowed, then turned sharply into a fenced compound. Floodlights glared overhead as the gates opened with mechanical precision. The van rolled to a stop inside the ICE detention facility, a gray, featureless building that radiated cold authority. The agents yanked Alejandro out roughly, ignoring the stiffness in his shoulders. The cuffs bit into his skin as they marched him inside. The hall smelled of disinfectant and bureaucracy. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Every detail reminded him not of safety, but of captivity. They shoved him into a windowless interrogation room, a metal table bolted to the floor, two chairs facing each other like opponents in a duel. They sat him down, leaving the cuffs on. Danner leaned against the wall, arms folded, smirk plastered across his face. Wilson shuffled papers theatrically, pretending there was already a file on their suspect. "Name," Wilson demanded. Alejandro met his eyes. "You already know my name." "Don't get smart," Danner snapped. "We'll find out one way or another. Better to cooperate." Calmly, Alejandro spoke. "Alejandro Torres, born in San Diego, California. U.S. citizen, veteran." Wilson scribbled on a clipboard, rolling his eyes. "Sure you are. That's the oldest story in the book. You guys always say you were born here." Alejandro tilted his head slightly. "So now being born in the United States is a crime." Danner slammed a fist on the table, the sound echoing. "Don't test me." "You think your attitude's gonna help you? You don't know who you're dealing with." Alejandro's lips pressed into a thin line. If only you knew who you're dealing with, he thought. But he said nothing. Silence was power. The agents circled like vultures. They asked about his entry point, about how long he'd been in the country, about fake documents. Each question was delivered with the assumption of guilt. Alejandro answered in measured tones, his composure unshaken. He gave only facts, never anger. Every second of his restraint was deliberate, an act of quiet defiance. Hours dragged. The agents grew frustrated. Wilson left the room to check databases. Danner stayed behind, leaning across the table. You want to make this easy on yourself? Just admit it. You're here illegally. We cut a deal, you walk free sooner. No one needs to know. Alejandro stared at him, unblinking. I will not admit to a lie. Danner sneered. Then get used to concrete walls, amigo. Just then the door creaked open. Wilson returned, frowning. He whispered something into Danner's ear. Danner's expression flickered just for a second before hardening again. Alejandro caught it immediately. Years of intelligence work had trained him to read micro-expressions. The split second tells that reveal truth before words do. Something in the system had raised a flag. But instead of acknowledging it, the agents doubled down. Wilson cleared his throat. Database was inconclusive. Could be a glitch, but we'll get more. Alejandro allowed himself the faintest smile. The net was unraveling thread by thread. Until then, Danner barked, you stay here. No calls, no rights, nothing. You're lucky we don't throw you in with the general population right now. The door slammed shut behind them, leaving Alejandro alone in the cold room. He exhaled slowly, then leaned back against the chair. His wrists ached, but his spirit remained unbroken. On the table, unnoticed by the agents, lay the Navy envelope that had spilled from his briefcase earlier. A small corner stuck out of Wilson's folder, stamped with the unmistakable crest of the Department of the Navy. If either man had taken a closer look, they would have realized the gravity of their mistake. But arrogance blinded them. In the silence, Alejandro thought of his family. His wife Elena waiting for him in Virginia. His son, a lieutenant in the Marine Corps currently deployed overseas. His daughter, a law student passionate about civil rights. How would they react when they learned of this? Would his son burn with anger? Would his daughter turn it into a case study of systemic abuse? He shook the thoughts away. Right now, what mattered was endurance. He had endured storms at sea, and he would endure this. The truth was a tide, unstoppable, inevitable. Time passed, minutes, maybe hours. The room's clock had no hands, only a digital beep every hour. Eventually, the door opened again. Wilson returned with 2 guards and a camera. Photograph and print him, Wilson ordered curtly. We'll run biometrics. The guards uncuffed him just long enough to press his fingers against the scanner, to snap photographs of his face. Alejandro stood tall in each frame, refusing to let them capture defeat. When the guards shoved him back into the chair, he didn't resist. As they processed the data, Wilson frowned at the screen. This can't be right. Danner peered over his shoulder. What? System says he's flagged as military personnel. High clearance, Navy, Danner scoffed. Yeah, sure. Probably some stolen identity trick. We've seen it before, Alejandro finally spoke, his voice calm, almost cold. Keep doubting. Every second you waste, the hole you dig grows deeper. Wilson shifted uncomfortably, but Danner waved him off. Don't let him get in your head. He's bluffing. But Alejandro wasn't bluffing, and soon, their arrogance would collide with the full weight of the United States Navy. For now, though, he sat in silence, watching the agents fumble with truths they weren't ready to face. The storm was building. The detention facility buzzed with its usual low-grade chaos. Doors clanging, detainees murmuring and holding cells, agents typing furiously behind frosted glass windows. But inside the small interrogation room, a storm was brewing. Rear Admiral Alejandro Torres sat quietly, his hands resting on the table, his posture impeccable despite the long hours in custody. Across from him, Agents Danner and Wilson stared at a computer screen as if willing it to change. The biometric scan results glowed in bold letters. Match. U.S. Department of Defense personnel file clearance. Top secret status. Active duty. For a long moment, neither agent spoke. Wilson shifted uneasily, the bravado draining from his face. This can't be right. Must be a system error. Danner's jaw tightened. Don't buy into his act. These guys know how to play the system. Could be fake data, Alejandro arched a brow. Fake? Do you truly believe someone could fake their way into the Pentagon's encrypted biometric database? His tone was steady, almost pitying. Gentlemen, you've made a mistake. A serious one. The words hung in the air like a verdict. Danner slammed the monitor shut as if closing the laptop could erase the evidence. Don't think you've won anything. Until I see proof with my own eyes, you're just another suspect. Alejandro leaned forward slightly, his gaze piercing. Proof is already here. What you do next will determine whether this ends as a career mistake or a national scandal. The room chilled. Wilson swallowed hard, avoiding eye contact. He was young, eager, and ambitious, but not stupid. He knew the system didn't just glitch and spit out Rear Admiral. Somewhere in Washington, alarms were already ringing, and he was right. In Arlington, Virginia, inside the fortified walls of the Pentagon, a red notification pinged across the Navy's personnel command systems. A flagged biometric scan had identified an officer currently on leave, Rear Admiral Alejandro Torres, processed by ICE as a detainee. Within minutes, a duty officer escalated the report up the chain. By the time the West Coast dawn began to break, a Navy liaison officer was already drafting inquiries to the Department of Homeland Security. Phones rang in ICE regional headquarters, each call sharper and more urgent than the last. Back in El Paso, however, Danner and Wilson were still trying to contain the situation. Hours later, the door to the interrogation room opened, and a new figure stepped inside. She was older, sharp-eyed, and wore a tailored suit instead of tactical gear. Her badge identified her as Supervisory Special Agent Maria Cortez, Regional Director of ICE Operations. She gave Alejandro a long, assessing look before turning to her men. "What's going on here?" Danner straightened, puffing out his chest. "We detained a suspect at the bus terminal. No ID, refusing to cooperate. We're processing him for removal." Cortez's brow furrowed. "And you ran his prints?" "Yes, ma'am," Wilson said quickly. "System says he's military. High clearance. But it's got to be some kind of fraud." Cortez's gaze hardened. "Fraud? Into the Department of Defense database?" She turned slowly, eyes locking onto Alejandro. "Sir, can you confirm your identity for me?" Alejandro's voice was calm, deliberate. "Rear Admiral Alejandro Torres, service number 84902, active duty United States Navy." Silence followed, heavy and undeniable. Cortez's lips pressed into a thin line. She looked at her men with a mix of fury and disbelief. "You laid hands on him?" Danner bristled. He resisted what?" She cut him off sharply. "A baseless stop? Harassment? Do you have any idea who you just dragged in here?" Wilson flinched. Danner's face flushed red, but he said nothing. Cortez turned back to Alejandro, her tone softening. "Admiral, on behalf of this agency, I sincerely apologize. This should never have happened." Alejandro held her gaze unblinking. "Apologies do not erase bruises. Or the humiliation." Her face tightened. She knew this was bigger than a simple internal report. If word leaked, if the press got hold of it, it could rock the agency to its core. And outside, the cracks were already spreading. At that very moment, a young woman's video was climbing rapidly through social media feeds. Shot on a shaky phone inside the bus terminal, it showed 2 ICE agents shoving a Latino man against the wall, cuffing him roughly, ignoring his protests of citizenship. The caption read, "ICE abuses another Latino man in El Paso. When will this stop?" Within hours, it had thousands of views. By the time Alejandro was being processed, the video had reached a local news station. The anchor teased it at the top of the evening broadcast. Coming up, shocking footage of ICE agents detaining a man in El Paso. Was it lawful or racial profiling? The story was breaking, and no one inside ICE's walls realized how quickly it was spiraling out of their control. Back in the interrogation room, Alejandro sat quietly, his silence louder than any accusation. Cortez dismissed Danner and Wilson with a sharp wave. "Out. Now." They obeyed reluctantly, their footsteps heavy with tension. When the door shut, Cortez exhaled. "Admiral Torres," she said carefully, "we're contacting the Department of Defense immediately. They'll want to handle this personally. In the meantime, please, allow me to ensure you're treated with the respect you deserve." Alejandro leaned back slightly, his expression unreadable. "Respect is not a courtesy, Agent Cortez. It is a right. One your men violated the moment they laid eyes on me." Her jaw clenched. She had no defense. He was right. Then Alejandro added, his voice cold as steel. "And when this story breaks, it will not be just about me. It will be about every person who has suffered what I did today. without the shield of a uniform, without rank, without the ability to fight back. Cortez swallowed hard. She understood the weight of his words. This wasn't just a scandal. It was a reckoning. In Washington, the first calls were already being made. A Navy admiral was on the line with the DHS undersecretary demanding answers. A senator from California, Torres's home state, was drafting a statement condemning ICE abuses. Journalists were circling, their sources feeding them whispers of a high-profile detention gone wrong. And inside the El Paso facility, 2 ICE agents sat nervously in a side office, arguing in hushed voices. "You said he was just some illegal," Wilson hissed. "Now we find out he's a rear admiral? We're screwed, Mark, screwed." Danner's face twisted with stubborn denial. "No, we play it smart. Say he resisted, say he lied, say—" Wilson cut him off. "Say what?" "The Navy's already involved. They're not going to believe us over him." But Danner wasn't listening. His pride wouldn't allow him to admit what they both knew. They had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Meanwhile, Alejandro sat alone in a more comfortable room, still not free but no longer chained to a chair. He sipped water from a paper cup, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. His thoughts were steady, disciplined. He wasn't planning revenge. He was preparing justice because soon the world would know the truth, and when it did, the names of Agents Danner and Wilson would not be remembered as protectors of America's borders, but as men who mistook prejudice for patriotism and lost everything in the process. By dawn, the story had escaped the walls of the El Paso detention facility and spread like wildfire. Local news stations ran the shaky cell phone video on repeat. 2 ICE agents slamming a Latino man against the wall of the bus terminal, shoving him into cuffs, dragging him across the floor. The audio, though muffled, caught his steady protest. "I am a U.S. citizen. This is a grave mistake." At first, viewers assumed it was another tragic case of profiling, another story that would fade within a news cycle. But then whispers surfaced. This wasn't just any man. The man in the video wasn't undocumented, wasn't anonymous. He was a decorated U.S. Navy officer. By mid-morning, the words "Rear Admiral Torres" were trending across social media. Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram feeds lit up with outrage. "ICE assaults a Navy admiral." Read that again. If this can happen to him, imagine what happens to those without rank, without cameras. Admiral Torres fought for this country. ICE fought him. Cable networks picked it up next. CNN flashed the headline, "ICE agents detain rear admiral in El Paso. Mistaken identity or abuse?" Fox News asked, "Did ICE cross the line?" MSNBC declared, "A national embarrassment. Navy admiral mistaken for undocumented immigrant." The scandal had legs, and it was running. Inside the El Paso facility, the atmosphere was electric with fear. Supervisory Agent Maria Cortez barked orders at subordinates, trying to stay ahead of the tidal wave. "No one talks to the press without clearance. Lock down all footage, all reports. We'll issue a statement once DC approves." But it was already too late. The Navy had confirmed Torres's identity. Reporters were swarming outside the gates, cameras flashing, microphones extended, demanding access. Danner and Wilson sat in a cramped office, sweat beading their brows. Wilson's leg bounced nervously. "They're gonna crucify us, Mark. You saw the feeds. He's all over the news." Danner's jaw clenched. "We stick to protocol. Say he resisted. Say he refused ID. We followed procedure." Wilson snapped back. "Procedure? He told us he was a citizen. He gave his name. And now the Navy's breathing down our necks. We're done." But Danner refused to bend. Pride more than fear kept him upright. "I don't care if he's a rear admiral. He disrespected me, and I don't take that from anyone." Wilson stared at him, horror dawning. "Do you hear yourself? This isn't about you. This is about the entire agency now." For once, Danner had no reply. Meanwhile, Alejandro Torres sat in a conference room, not a cell this time, but still under watch. He was no longer handcuffed, but the bruises on his wrists were visible, dark marks against his skin. He wore the same polo shirt and khakis, but the room seemed to shrink around his presence. Even out of uniform, he radiated command. Across from him sat Cortez, flanked by 2 DHS lawyers. Their tone was carefully measured, rehearsed. "Admiral Torres," one lawyer began, "let us first express our deepest apologies. This incident was an unfortunate misunderstanding." Alejandro cut him off, his voice sharp but calm. Do not insult me with euphemisms. This was not a misunderstanding. It was misconduct, abuse, and it did not happen in isolation. Cortez shifted uncomfortably. The lawyers exchanged glances. Alejandro continued, his words deliberate. You detained me unlawfully. You assaulted me. And you denied me basic rights. The only difference between me and the dozens of men in your cells right now is that my service record triggered alarms in Washington. Silence. The lawyers scribbled notes, trying not to meet his gaze. Alejandro leaned forward. This is not just about me. This is about the culture of your agency, about how power has rotted into arrogance. I intend to speak about this not just to the Navy, not just to the Pentagon, but to the American people. Cortez's eyes widened. Admiral, please. We can resolve this internally. A formal apology, disciplinary action against the agents involved. Alejandro's voice cut like a blade. No, I've commanded fleets in war zones. I've negotiated with foreign ministers under fire. I will not be silenced in my own country. The weight of his words filled the room. For Cortez, it was clear. This man wasn't just a victim. He was a leader, and now he had a platform. Outside, the Navy had already mobilized. A press statement confirmed that Rear Admiral Alejandro Torres had been detained in error by ICE agents and that the Navy was cooperating fully to ensure his immediate release, but the statement didn't calm the storm, it fueled it. Reporters demanded answers. Senators lined up to condemn ICE. One veterans group released a fiery statement. Rear Admiral Torres dedicated his life to defending this country. Today, he was treated like a criminal because of the color of his skin. This is not who we are as Americans. Within hours, protesters gathered outside ICE headquarters in El Paso. They carried signs. Justice for Torres. Honor our veterans. ICE, what injustice. Chants filled the air, echoing against the gray walls. Inside, Cortez's phone rang nonstop. Washington wanted updates every hour. DHS headquarters was in crisis mode, and the agents at the center of it all, Danner and Wilson, were suspended pending investigation. But Alejandro wasn't satisfied with suspension. He wanted accountability. That evening, he was escorted to a private office where a Navy liaison officer awaited him with a crisp salute. Admiral, sir, transportation is ready to take you back to base. The Secretary of the Navy is expecting your call. Alejandro returned the salute but didn't rise immediately. His eyes lingered on the facility's walls, the locked doors, the distant cries of detainees who had no rank, no admirals calling in favors, no media outrage to shield them. He spoke quietly to the liaison. I will leave, but not quietly. The officer nodded, understanding. Understood, sir. That night, Alejandro's face appeared on every major news broadcast. The networks replayed the video, then cut to his official Navy portrait, dressed in uniform, rows of medals gleaming on his chest. The contrast was stark. The same man who had been shoved against a wall like a criminal was also a rear admiral who had commanded ships across the Pacific. Anchors spoke with incredulity. How could this happen? How could two agents mistake a U.S. Navy admiral for an undocumented immigrant? The question was rhetorical. The answer was obvious. It wasn't a mistake, it was bias, prejudice, and unchecked power. And in the days to come, Alejandro Torres would make sure America understood that truth. Because for the first time in decades, a man who had spent his life defending his country wasn't standing behind the flag. He was standing in front of it, demanding that the nation live up to its promise. The silence in the federal courthouse was heavy, almost suffocating. Rows of reporters had filled the benches, their cameras poised, their pens ready. The story of an innocent Latino man beaten and detained by ICE had already spread across the country like wildfire, igniting protests in dozens of cities. But what no one had expected was the revelation that the man was not just any American citizen. He was Rear Admiral Gabriel Ramirez, a decorated U.S. Navy officer who had commanded fleets, advised presidents, and risked his life in service to the nation. The ICE agents who had manhandled him now sat at the defense table, their once confident expressions hollowed by fear. Gone were the smug smirks they wore when they dragged him through the terminal. Now they avoided his gaze, shifting uncomfortably in their uniforms as the judge called the session to order. Rear Admiral Ramirez sat across from them, not in a plaintiff's chair, Not as a victim begging for justice, but as a man of stature. His posture was perfect, his uniform crisp, the ribbons and stars on his chest glinting under the courtroom lights. He hadn't wanted to wear the dress whites today, but his advisors insisted. America needed to see who he was. America needed to see the stark contrast between the hero who had served and the thugs who had trampled his dignity. The prosecutor rose, voice steady. Your Honor, what happened on that night was not an error in paperwork. It was not a misunderstanding. It was the willful abuse of power by federal agents who believed they could act above the law. They profiled Admiral Ramirez based solely on the color of his skin, ignored his protests of citizenship, and subjected him to a beating that left him hospitalized. This is not only a crime against him, it is a crime against the uniform he wears and the nation he swore to defend. Gasps murmured through the crowd. Reporters scribbled furiously, their headlines already taking shape. One of the ICE agents, a tall man with a shaved head, suddenly stood up. His attorney pulled on his sleeve, but the man blurted out anyway. We didn't know who he was. We thought he was just another. The judge slammed the gavel down. Sit down. This court will not tolerate excuses rooted in prejudice. Admiral Ramirez didn't flinch. He kept his eyes forward, calm and resolute. He had faced missile fire in the Persian Gulf, hurricanes at sea, and sleepless nights in the Pentagon war room. Compared to those, this courtroom was just another battlefield, one fought with words instead of weapons. When it was his turn to speak, he rose slowly. The entire room stood with him, not out of requirement but out of respect. His voice was deep, steady, and deliberate. I did not come here to destroy careers. I came here because what happened to me happens to people without uniforms every single day. Men and women who don't have medals to prove their loyalty, who don't have stars on their shoulders, who don't have a platform to be heard. They suffer in silence. They vanish into detention centers and their stories are never told. If this country can treat a rear admiral like a criminal, imagine how it treats the voiceless. A wave of emotion rippled through the courtroom. Even the judge paused, visibly moved. Ramirez continued, I love this nation. I bled for it. I lost sailors under my command defending it. But love for country does not mean silence in the face of its failures. Patriotism means demanding better. And today I demand better. Not for me, but for every person whose humanity has been questioned because of the language they speak, the color of their skin, or the place they were born. There was silence. Heavy, reverent silence. Then slowly the audience began to clap. Not the thunderous applause of celebration, but the measured, heartfelt rhythm of acknowledgement. A standing ovation in a federal courtroom was rare, but no one stopped it. The verdict was swift. The ICE agents were found guilty of assault, civil rights violations, and abuse of power. Their badges were stripped in disgrace, their sentences pending. More importantly, the incident sparked a sweeping review of ICE practices, with lawmakers introducing new oversight bills inspired directly by Ramirez's testimony. Outside the courthouse, cameras swarmed him. Microphones were thrust in his face. Admiral, what's next? Admiral, do you forgive them? Admiral, will you run for office? He raised a hand for silence. This isn't about me. It's about accountability. I will return to my post. I will continue serving my country. And I will continue speaking out until we live in an America where justice does not depend on the uniform you wear. That night, Ramirez sat alone in his study, the weight of the day pressing on his shoulders. His medals gleamed from their display case, reminders of a lifetime of service. But what mattered more were the letters that had already begun arriving. From Latino families, from veterans, from immigrants, from ordinary citizens who saw in his ordeal a reflection of their own struggles. He realized then that his true battle wasn't at sea or in strategy rooms. It was here on the home front, in the fight to uphold the very ideals he had sworn to defend. As he closed his eyes, exhaustion finally setting in, he whispered the words he had repeated countless times over his career. For freedom, for justice, for those who cannot fight for themselves. And with that, Rear Admiral Gabriel Ramirez, a sailor, leader, patriot, survivor, prepared for the next mission. This time the battlefield was America itself.